Welcome to this demo of FortiClient EMS 6.4. I'm going to focus the demo today on FortiClient as a fabric agent and talk about how FortiClient and FortiClient EMS connect with the rest of the Fortinet security fabric. If we look at our fabric topology and drill down into the individual workstations, you can see that we can gather a lot of information about workstations in our environment that is provided by FortiClient EMS. In this case, I can see the logged in user, I can see the IP address, as well as that it's registered with an EMS server and its online or offline status. I have visibility into the MAC address as well as any additional MAC addresses on this endpoint. So if I see traffic from a wired interface and then also see traffic later from a wireless interface, we can correlate those logs to see all traffic to or from any particular device. I also can see the domain as well as the operating system for the endpoint and where it sits in the Fortinet security fabric, in this case connected to my enterprise first floor FortiGate. I also have visibility into the vulnerability details that are provided by FortiClient EMS. So when FortiClient scans the workstations in the environment and identifies vulnerabilities, it reports those back to FortiClient EMS, as well as to the FortiGates that are part of the security fabric. You'll also notice when we look at endpoints in our topology view that some of them are highlighted in red, and that indicates that those workstations have been identified as compromised endpoints. The compromised endpoint indicator is provided by FortiAnalyzer via the FortiAnalyzer IOC. And we can utilize that information to allow an administrator to be able to take an action on an endpoint based on the IOC details that are provided by FortiAnalyzer. So an administrator might see an endpoint show as compromised and might determine that it's necessary to quarantine that endpoint from communicating with other devices on the network. Manually isolating an endpoint is beneficial to prevent a compromised host from spreading a virus or malware to other devices in the nearby vicinity. But FortiOS also allows for automation via automation stitches that can leverage information from FortiClient to take action on endpoints that are compromised in the environment. When we look at the automation stitches in FortiOS, we can see that there are a variety of triggers and a variety of actions that we can take based on the presence of a particular trigger. In this case, I'm going to focus on the compromised host trigger. So when we see this trigger in the security fabric, we can take any one of these actions. In this case, I'm going to quarantine the endpoint with FortiClient. So what will happen here is when FortiOS receives the indicator of compromise from FortiAnalyzer, it'll share that information with the FortiClient EMS server. And then the FortiClient EMS server will quarantine the endpoint at the host level, preventing it from communicating with any devices on the nearby network. Now, in addition to quarantining the endpoint, we can also send an email. That way we can notify an administrator that an endpoint has been quarantined and that an endpoint was identified as compromised. Now, all the telemetry information and the automation stitches are possible because of the fabric connector. In FortiClient EMS 6.2, there were two fabric connectors, one in the security fabric configuration and the FSSO connector, which allowed FortiClient EMS to send dynamic host tag information to FortiOS that could be utilized in the FortiClient IPv4 policy. In FortiClient 6.4, it has been consolidated into a single connector that handles both sending telemetry information as well as the dynamic host tag information generated by the FortiClient EMS server. There is one other piece of automation that I want to talk about before we move to the EMS server to talk about the dynamic host tags. There is a new connector in 6.4 for FortiAnalyzer. Looking at the connectors in FortiAnalyzer, we can see the EMS connector, and we can see the different actions that are available to be utilized inside the playbooks in the FortiAnalyzer FortiSOC section. If we look at the playbook, and I'll look at the EMS quarantine endpoint playbook, We can see that in this case, we're going to quarantine an endpoint, and we're going to use the EMS connector to take that action and quarantine the endpoint at the host level. We're also going to then attach data to an incident so that we can utilize that data when we generate our reports in FortiAnalyzer. Now, looking at the playbook monitor, we can see that these rules continually process, and we can then leverage that information in taking automated action based on triggers that we identify. Moving over to the EMS server, we'll take a look at the compliance verification rules. And as we look at the compliance verification rules that are available, we can create a wide variety of rules based on a variety of factors to identify endpoints and tag them for use in FortiGate profiles. Moving to the EMS server, we'll take a look at the compliance verification rules. Now, in the compliance verification rule, we can create rules using a variety of rule types, from Active Directory groups, where we can tag machines based on their membership in or not in a particular Active Directory group. We can also look for installed or up-to-date antivirus software running on an endpoint. We can look for, is it managed by an EMS server? We can also look for maybe a corporate issued certificate or a presence of a registry key, a running process, or even vulnerable device or Windows security features. And we can see if certain features are enabled or disabled. And then utilizing these rules, we can send that host tag information in real time to FortiOS, where we can utilize it inside our firewall policy. So here you'll see a variety of host tags that were generated on this EMS server. I have some corporate endpoint tags, as well as customer support, a marketing device, and then 2 devices that were identified as vulnerable workstations. If we look at our FortiGate firewall, you can see that I also have those dynamic host tags present in my address list in my policy and objects. Now, in FortiClient 6.2, the dynamic host tags were in the FSSO user groups. In FortiOS 6.4, they are now address objects. This gives us greater flexibility in how we apply them to our firewall policy. So if we look at our firewall policy, you can see that I've created a couple of rules. One using the vulnerable devices tag from FortiClient EMS, trying to reach a destination of one of the resources on our marketing network. And if I see a vulnerable device attempting to reach the marketing network, I'm going to go ahead and deny access to those resources. Likewise, if I see a member of the marketing group identified by the presence of the dynamic EMS tag for marketing, trying to reach the marketing resources, I'm going to go ahead and accept that connection and allow them access to those resources. Now, as machines move in and out of different states, the dynamic host tags from EMS are updated in real time on the FortiGate firewall. So this allows a device to move into a vulnerable device group, and then once it's remediated and those vulnerabilities are patched, it will move back out of that vulnerable device group, and connectivity to internal resources can be restored. And that ends the demo of FortiClient EMS as a Fabric agent. I hope you enjoyed the demo, and thank you very much for watching.